The US Federal Reserve Chairman has delivered a stark message on the state of the economy. Jerome Powell has warned of interest rate rises to bring inflation back to 2%.
Jay Powell explains the Fed chair in a widely expected talk on inflation and recession, making remarks to investors and economists on Friday morning. The marquee event at the Fed's annual symposium at Jackson Hole, Powell giving an update on where the Fed is heading on interest rates.
Another unusually large increase could be appropriate at our next meeting. Our decision at this September meeting will depend on the totality of the incoming data and the evolving outlook.
With inflation around 9%, Powell stressed the Fed is determined to bring it down no matter what it takes.
While higher interest rates, slower growth, and softer labor market conditions will bring down inflation, they will also bring some pain to households and businesses. But a failure to restore price stability would mean far greater pain.
To battle inflation, the Fed has lifted its benchmark rate by 2 full percentage points in just 4 of its meetings. But there are fears they may cause a recession in the process.
Whether we avoid that or not, if we had one, it would be shallow in my view and short. Just given the strength of the labor market alone, this is an unusual situation.
On Thursday, the government said the economy shrank at an annual rate of 0.6%, marking a second straight quarter of contraction. But hiring remains high and layoffs are relatively low. Inflation is still crushingly high, though it has shown some signs of easing because of lowering gas prices.
Let's go live to Current Affairs Advisor for Data for Progress, Aidan Smith. This is very difficult for pockets of the United States, enormously difficult for homes.
Absolutely. Like always, I'm so glad to be back on the show to talk about some of the most pressing issues facing America and the world. And in this case, as we've seen globally, most highly developed countries are experiencing pretty severe inflation not seen in several decades since the onset of COVID. And a lot of people, myself included to an extent, believe that some of the inflation that we're seeing is largely a consequence of a very, very historically fast recovery following the 2020 COVID recession. But with that will come pains. And in the context of what the Fed is doing, you know, there will always be politics surrounding this, and that's reasonable because it's not an apolitical institution by any means. There will be people accusing Powell of trying to induce a recession, and as in the clip we just saw, he's very steadfast in saying that the measures the Fed is taking to control inflation could very well cause harms in the form of, as many believe, higher unemployment rate, at least in the short term. But overall, what we are seeing in America is comparative relief for consumers even before this. One of our major, if not the single biggest indicator of consumer confidence in the United States are gas prices. And we're actually seeing them go down a bit, not nearly to the lows that we saw in the onset of the COVID era back almost a half years ago now. But compared to what we were seeing earlier a few months ago, which was especially exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the supply chain shock that further created, we're seeing Americans get a little bit less. Basically, what I'm saying is that there is optimism for the American consumer economy in the short term, while in other places like the UK, for example, we're seeing that Citi just projected 18% inflation rate for the next year or whatever period they covered. I was just recalling that. But as it stands, I think that American consumers and working families are going to see relief after a pretty brutal year of inflation.
Yeah, it's been a pretty extraordinary few years, really, hasn't it, with the pandemic preceding it. A lot of Americans would raise their eyebrows at the whole idea of spending another $3 billion in the Ukraine, but Joe Biden announced that this week.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about foreign policy is that there's obviously been popular movements or high-profile public debate regarding foreign policy on a number of issues, especially related to the Middle East in the 2000s, especially with the protests against the Iraq war and other similar occurrences. In the case of Ukraine, a lot of the American public has largely tuned out of the conflict, probably just about 2 months into it. In terms of the actual amount of money allocated, I think that the argument that most foreign policy observers would say that even if they don't necessarily agree with that number or would like a less or more aggressive approach to it, but what they would say is that this is an investment in America's national security, in the national security of Western Europe, and frankly, the world. Because, the fact of the matter is, if Putin is able to get away with annexing a foreign state, the whole post-World War II security apparatus is basically defunct. And from there, that's just a Pandora's box of more nuclear armed states, such as possibly China, in the case of Taiwan, but also Vietnam, which is another possibility. So in a sense, there is support among what we want to consider like policy circles for these measures. But obviously there has been some criticism from people who are saying that, if Biden can cancel X amount of student debt, why, or like an argument that is, usually not mathematically sound, but from people online who think that, he needs to do more student debt cancellation instead of, giving money to Ukrainians.
What about Mar-a-Lago and the raids? Is this what will bring Donald Trump down, do you think? Does this almost dismiss the chance of him running at the next election?
So I think that because we're used to, after Trump came on, I mean, he's been there since the 90s, frankly, but I'm thinking of 2015 as a cutoff point to the era from 2015 to present, really the age of Trump in American politics. There's been, innumerable cases in which people thought that some scandal or some particularly huge public controversy could end his, political aspirations. So I'm, as serious as what they found are, I would hesitate personally to determine that this will be the thing that eventually ends up, destroying his chance of returning to office. What I would say is two things, and I think that we're learning a lot about the politics of the situation from the response to this. For one, there actually hasn't been massive blowback by any means against the Biden administration and AG Garland for the raids, because obviously when you're in a developed democracy governed by the rule of law, it's still the reality that when a former elected official with a very large following gets into legal trouble, there will always be accusations that this was a political hatchet job. And while it's definitely the case that plenty of the Republican base do believe this, in terms of polls at large, it does not look like the public thinks that Biden or the DOJ, Garland, or the FBI, et cetera, are engaging in unfair, politically biased investigations. So I think that that's a very interesting point to consider. And the second, which is in a way paradoxical, or at least, really is really a juxtaposition to what we're seeing on the national stage, is that a lot of Republican consultants, I was reading an Axios article about this, actually think that this might lead to Republicans rallying around Trump in a 2024 primary against prospective foes, such as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, by reinvigorating the base and convincing his very dedicated followers that this was some kind of, politically motivated investigation. So I think that the political ramifications of this are readily apparent in those two ways, but I don't think that just because we've had so many other instances where this looked to be the case, that this will be the thing that ends up harming and eventually destroying Trump's chances of winning again.
Yeah, Trumpian politics, it doesn't follow a script, does it? Aidan, good to talk. We'll catch up real soon, eh?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.